Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Always exciting to dive into a new topic.
And this time, we're tackling a book that I know a lot of you have been curious about.
The 100, a ranking of the most influential persons in history.
Such a bold idea, right?
Yeah.
To actually try and rank the 100 most influential people?
Yeah, ranking historical figures is always going to be subjective.
Totally. But that's part of what makes it so fascinating, I think.
Definitely. It forces you to grapple with some really big questions.
Like, what does it even mean to be influential? How do you measure that impact over centuries?
Exactly. And this book, it really dives headfirst into those questions.
And in a way that I have to admit kind of surprised me.
I think the author, Michael H. Hart, was aiming for that.
Especially with his #1 choice.
Placing Muhammad at the top of the list definitely raised some eyebrows.
It did for me. I mean, when you think of the most influential figures in history, who comes to mind?
You probably think of iconic scientists like Newton, or maybe political leaders like Caesar or Genghis Khan.
Or maybe a religious figure like Jesus or Buddha.
Right. All individuals who have shaped the world in profound ways.
So to see Muhammad at the very top, I was definitely intrigued.
And I think a lot of people might be wondering, what makes him stand out? Why did the author choose him?
Exactly. So let's unpack that a bit. Maybe we could start with a little background on Muhammad himself.
Sure thing. Muhammad was born in Mecca around 570 AD.
And his early life, from what I understand, it wasn't easy.
No, not at all. He was orphaned at a young age, faced quite a bit of hardship.
And yet, despite those challenges, he went on to found one of the world's major religions.
Exactly. Around the age of 40, he began having these profound spiritual experiences.
And these experiences, they formed the basis of Islam, right?
That's right. These revelations, they became the foundation for the Quran, the holy book of Islam.
Which then obviously spread rapidly.
It's pretty remarkable how quickly Islam expanded under his leadership.
The maps we have here really illustrate that, don't they?
They do. In just over a century, the Muslim empire grew from the Arabian Peninsula to this vast territory.
Across the Middle East, North Africa, even parts of Europe.
It's a level of expansion and influence that's really quite rare in history.
So let's come back to the book's main question.
Why Muhammad? What convinced the author to rank him so high?
Because most people, when they think of profound religious influence,
They think of figures like Jesus or Buddha.
whose teachings have resonated across centuries.
And those are definitely valid comparisons. But the book argues that Muhammad was something more.
Not just a spiritual leader.
He was also a political and military leader.
So he wasn't just shaping beliefs, he was actively building an empire.
He was uniting warring Arab tribes, establishing a legal system.
And leading military campaigns that would reshape the political landscape of his time.
His influence, it extended far beyond just the realm of religion.
So that makes the comparison to other figures a lot more complicated.
Because you have someone like Newton, for instance, who revolutionized scientific thought.
But his impact? It was largely confined to that realm, to science.
Whereas with Muhammad, you see this influence across virtually every aspect of life.
Religion, politics, law, culture, you name it.
And not just for a small group of people, but for millions across a huge geographical area.
Which begs the question, how do you measure something like that? I mean, what's the yardstick for influence on such a massive scale?
That's a fantastic question, and it's something that the book really wrestles with.
Because is it simply about the number of people impacted?
Or is it about the depth of the change that was brought about?
Or perhaps the longevity of that impact? How long did those changes endure?
The author seems to be saying that Muhammad's influence, it was this unique blend of breadth, depth, and lasting power.
That he didn't just shape beliefs. He shaped civilizations in a way that very few others have.
And that's a really compelling argument, no doubt. But I think before we go too deep into analyzing the author's conclusions, maybe it's worth taking a step back.
And really unpacking those criteria for measuring influence itself.
Because that's a whole can of worms in and of itself.
It really is, isn't it? It really is, isn't it? It's kind of like we've stumbled into a rabbit hole.
A rabbit hole of historical influence. It's so much more than just cause and effect.
Yeah, and I think we often fall into that trap, right? Thinking of it in this linear way.
It's tempting to simplify things, but historical influence is more like this tangled web.
With all these threads, these ripples, extending outwards in ways we can't always grasp.
Exactly. So how do we even begin to untangle that web? How do we measure influence beyond just, say, the number of people affected?
Yeah, because sheer numbers, that doesn't tell the whole story.
Not at all. One way to think about it is to consider the depth of the change.
Like, did someone simply introduce a new idea? Or did they fundamentally alter the way people live their lives?
That's a key distinction. It's the difference between inventing a new gadget
versus sparking a revolution that completely reshapes society.
Exactly. And then there's the question of longevity, right? Some historical figures, they have this explosive impact that fades quickly,
while others exert a more gradual, but ultimately more enduring influence over centuries.
It's like comparing a comet to a mountain range.
Both impactful in their own way, but on completely different timescales.
I like that analogy. And when you apply these lenses to Muhammad's influence,
it starts to become clearer why the author put him so high in the rankings.
Because he really seems to tick all the boxes, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, the breadth of his impact across so many different spheres of life.
The depth of the changes he brought about, especially in terms of shaping entire civilizations.
And that longevity we talked about. His influence is still felt today, over 1,400 years later.
You can see it everywhere, in the spread of Islam, of course, but also in the development of the Arabic language.
In legal systems, in architectural styles, even in artistic traditions across vast regions.
It's almost like trying to picture the world without, say, the Roman Empire.
It's so deeply woven into the fabric of Western civilization, it's hard to imagine things without it.
And that brings up another fascinating aspect of all this: the ripple effects of influence.
How the actions of one person or group can trigger this chain of events.
That ultimately shaped the course of history in ways they could have never predicted.
It's the butterfly effect, right? That tiny little flap of wings can lead to a hurricane on the other side of the world.
Exactly. And that's what makes history so captivating, so endlessly complex.
It's not just about memorizing names and dates. It's about understanding those intricate connections.
And recognizing the power of individual actions to shape the world around us.
So, thinking about Muhammad's influence, as described in the book,
how do you think it challenges our typical understanding of historical significance?
I think it forces us to broaden our definition of what makes a truly influential figure.
Because we often tend to focus on political leaders, conquerors, inventors.
But what about religious figures who shape not only spiritual beliefs, but entire cultures?
That's a really crucial point, and it makes you wonder if maybe our traditional narratives have overlooked something.
If they haven't fully grasped the impact of figures like Muhammad.
It's definitely a possibility. And it highlights how important it is to constantly re-examine our assumptions about history.
To seek out diverse perspectives and challenge the narratives we've inherited.
Absolutely. We have to keep asking new questions and be open to unexpected answers.
Okay, so we've looked at different ways to measure influence and explored how Muhammad's impact fits into that framework.
But from your perspective, what's the most compelling argument the book makes for placing him at the top of the list?
Why Muhammad? Out of all the other remarkable individuals in history.
For me, it's the sheer persistence of his influence.
You think about it, empires rise and fall, scientific paradigm shift, even languages evolve.
But the core principles of Islam, those societal structures influenced by his teachings,
they've endured for over 1,400 years. That's a testament to the power and the depth of his impact.
It's a level of influence that transcends the typical markers of historical significance.
But even with all of this said, I do think it's important to acknowledge that ranking historical figures is inherently subjective.
Of course. And there's always going to be room for debate and disagreement.
And honestly, I think that's what makes these deep dives so interesting.
It's not about declaring winners or losers or establishing a definitive hierarchy.
It's about exploring the nuances of history, challenging our assumptions, or appreciating how complex it all really is.
It's about asking the right questions and being open to those unexpected answers we talked about.
Speaking of questions, I'm curious about something.
Go for it. What's on your mind?
The book, it focuses mainly on Muhammad's positive contributions.
On the ways he shaped the world for the better.
But did his actions also have any negative consequences? Things we should consider when evaluating his overall influence.
That's a crucial question, and it speaks to the need for a balanced and nuanced understanding of history.
Because while Muhammad's teachings did emphasize peace, compassion, justice,
his leadership also involved military conquests, the expansion of an empire.
And as with any major historical figure, his legacy is multifaceted, complex.
It's not a simple black and white picture.
And that complexity is exactly why we need to engage in these discussions thoughtfully, critically.
It's not about idolizing or demonizing individuals, but understanding the full spectrum of their actions.
And the ripple effects those actions had on the world, both positive and negative. And the ripple effects those actions had on the world, both positive and negative. It's a good reminder that history isn't just about celebrating heroes.
Or condemning villains, right? It's about recognizing that nuance, that complexity.
Understanding that human nature is messy, and that even the best intentions can have unintended consequences.
And that's one of the things I appreciate most about this book.
It pushes us to move beyond those simplistic narratives and engage with history on a much deeper level.
To really think critically about these big questions.
So as we wrap up our look at Muhammad and his influence as presented in the 100,
What are some key questions we should be asking ourselves as we continue to learn about history? About the impact individuals have had on the world?
because this goes way beyond just one figure, right? These are questions we can apply to anyone.
Exactly. And I think it starts with recognizing that influence itself isn't a simple concept.
It's not just about power or fame or even good intentions.
It's about that ability to shape thoughts, beliefs, behaviors, and ultimately the course of history.
For better or for worse.
Right. And that means looking beyond the surface level.
Really grappling with the nuances of these historical figures and their legacies.
Asking ourselves, what were their motivations? What was the world like around them?
How did their actions both reflect and shape the times they lived in?
And what were the long-term consequences of their choices?
Both the ones they intended and the ones they didn't.
And again, these are questions we can ask about any historical figure.
Not just Muhammad. It seems like the author's goal with this book was to spark those kinds of discussions.
To get people thinking critically about influence, about how we even measure something like that.
Because it's not an easy question to answer, is it?
Not at all. But that's what makes it so worthwhile to explore.
This deep dive isn't about accepting the author's rankings as the absolute truth.
It's about using them as a starting point for a deeper exploration.
For challenging our assumptions. For developing a more nuanced understanding of history.
So to bring it back to you, the listener, what can you take away from all of this?
From exploring Muhammad's influence and thinking about how we assess historical impact in general.
I'd say first and foremost, be curious. Don't take things at face value.
Don't just accept the traditional narratives or rankings without questioning them.
Dig deeper, ask those tough questions, seek out multiple perspectives.
And be prepared to be surprised. I mean, who would have thought? A 7th century religious leader from the Arabian Peninsula topping a list of the most influential people in history.
It definitely challenges our preconceived notions, and that's a good thing.
It means we're pushing ourselves to learn, to expand our understanding of the world.
To see things from new angles.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought.
If influence is about shaping the course of history, what kind of influence do you want to have?
What actions will you take? What ideas will you share? What will your legacy be?
Those are powerful questions and ones I think we all need to consider.
Because in the end, we're all part of this ongoing story.
Our choices, big and small, they contribute to shaping the world around us.
So think critically, act consciously, and leave your mark on the world.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.